For the next 50 minutes, we will be discussing clean, equitable mobility and transportation policies and programs at the local, state, and national level. Momentum has been growing on this topic lately, especially with the Biden administration's ambitious proposals to develop and fund thousands of clean energy jobs and electric vehicles and infrastructure. Momentum has been growing at the state level too, as we've seen with California Governor Newsom announcing a plan for California to phase out gasoline-powered cars, and many other states expanding on car sharing, bike sharing, and public transit. We are witnessing local communities develop and implement innovative clean mobility equity pilots and programs. But momentum and the spirit of progress towards reducing emissions is not enough. Frontline communities don't just need cleaner air. Black, Indigenous, and people of color across the country also need safer streets, good jobs, and the power to meaningfully weigh in on deciding how those clean mobility investments can best meet their needs. We need comprehensive clean mobility investments and programs that are designed to provide a wide array of multi-sector and transformative benefits to our communities. And to get there, we will need to work alongside local communities to understand their needs and develop policies and programs with them. Not only because they have the most at stake, they also often have the best solutions. This panel will explore some of the latest and best practices from across the country at each of the geographic levels: local, state, regional, and national. Our hope is that we can challenge ourselves to find and build synergy across transportation modes, sectors, and state lines. Because ultimately, we need an all of the above approach if we're going to create the sustainable and equitable future we so desperately need. During the panel, please enter questions and comments in the chat, and my fellow Greenliner, Hannah Krieger, will monitor the chat to answer questions and share resources. Now, without further ado, I'm going to transition us right into the panel by introducing our speakers. First up, we have Dr. Shelley Francis, a former medical school faculty member turned public health executive and entrepreneur. Her vision led the co-founding of the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. EV Hybrid Noire, a national 501c3 with thousands of members and chapters across the US and abroad. EV Hybrid Noire's mission is to advance electric vehicles and multimodal e-mobility solutions across the US and ensure those solutions are inclusive and equitable. Dr. Francis is also the co-founder and principal of EV Noire, an award-winning consulting group whose work centers on e-mobility best practices and e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Francis was recently recognized as one of the top women in EVs by Electric Drives. She currently serves as a national board director for the Electric Auto Association. Our next speaker is Marcel Porras, who has over 13 years of experience in transportation, planning, and economic development. Marcel is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the LA Department of Transportation and oversees the Bureau of Transportation Technology. The focus of his work is found at the intersection of mobility and technology, where he delivers on opportunities to scale mobility options for the visitors and residents of Los Angeles, while ensuring safe, sustainable, and equitable outcomes. Prior to joining LA DOT, he was the Associate Director of Transportation for Mayor Eric Garcetti. Our third speaker, Beth Osborne, is the Director of Transportation for America. She was previously at the US Department of Transportation, where she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and managed the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program and the development of policy proposals for the department. Before joining DOT, Beth worked for Senator Tom Carper as an advisor for transportation, trade, and labor policy, and as a legislative director for environmental policy at the Southern Governors Association. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us. Now let's get right into it. We're going to start with the first set of questions that are tailored for each specific panelist. Then, once we've heard from all three of you, we'll shift into a broader set of questions that we'd like to hear multiple perspectives on. So first, this question is for Beth. Can you talk about Transportation for America's 3 guiding principles for transportation investment, and if the Biden administration's transportation and infrastructure proposals are hitting the mark on these?
Absolutely. So Transportation for America is focused on giving people access to jobs and essential services, no matter whether they drive or not. And so our 3 priorities are designed to support that. We start with a fix-it-first policy, the notion that we should be maintaining and improving the system we've already built before we're building new things. If we do build new things, we should have a plan to maintain and improve that before it gets built. This is really important because in politics, it's often it's helpful and popular to build the new infrastructure, but not maintain existing infrastructure. And where that tends to fall most heavily is on underrepresented minority communities, where you're seeing nice new communities far outside of the job center getting built for wealthier people, while existing communities are being left to fall apart. The second priority that we work on is promoting safety over speed of vehicles. In fact, our most recent report, Dangerous by Design, shows that not only are roadways getting less safe for those walking, but in 2020, during the COVID pandemic and most of the shutdown, while traffic volumes were lower, fatalities went up. We saw the largest increase in a fatality rate in 96 years. It turns out that our roadways are designed in such a dangerous manner, so focused on moving vehicles quickly, that mistakes are just too frequent and they're too often deadly because of the high speed. So we're focused on where the people are, bringing down those speeds. And the last is measuring the success of the system based on access to jobs and essential services. And what we find is when you do a multimodal access measure, which you can do with just basic GIS and a lot of the same tools used in your smartphone to figure out where you need to go and how to get there, just applied to the transportation system, that you can determine where your system is functioning equitably and fairly to those who have a lot of money or not so much money, who might come from traditionally mistreated communities, ignored communities, underserved communities, and I can identify barriers to their access to economic success and help remove them. So those are the three things we're focusing on. Quickly, in answer to the second part of the question, I like the language coming out of the new administration. The verbiage is good. The sentiment is good. Now the question is whether or not that sentiment will get worked into actual language of regulations, guidance documents, policy, competitive grant programs, things passed by Congress. That's where things normally fall apart. So that's where we have to come in to make sure that the nice language turns into really good programs.
Thanks, Beth. Love the idea of really honing it down to three principles. I think that makes it much easier to digest and understand, but still very ambitious. Shelley, what do you think is a good example of a community-driven mobility equity pilot that is doing it right, or at least getting it close?
Well, thank you for that question, Isa. So the first step in any community-driven project is really to listen. Listen to the community or your target market. Show them respect for their expertise and experience. Hear their realities, their strengths, as well as hear the areas of opportunity. EV Hybrid Noire really prioritizes listening to community members and key stakeholders through a range of methods. So whether it's via one-on-one conversations or interviews, or multiple folks engaged in a town hall. We have also repeatedly seen projects implemented with this one-size-fits-all approach, which is a very generic approach that does not work in an equitable or sustainable manner because the community voice and input and needs is often overlooked. So a good example of a community-driven mobility equity pilot that we're currently working on is that we're working with rideshare services that are seeking to really expand services to diverse communities, including racially diverse and lower income consumers, as well as looking to electrify their fleets. So our team is carrying out a comprehensive project where we're utilizing both qualitative and quantitative methods centered in equity and using a human-centered research approach. So for us, what that means is that there's continual engagement with key stakeholders and community members. And then to address another point is just thinking about the questions that you utilize when we work with community partners and our target audiences. We don't just ask them like, how do you get from point A to point B? Okay. Instead, we also take a deeper dive and we talk about things like, what do you value? Now, who do you trust? Who are your trusted messengers? What support or information do you need to make this transition and make it make sense and be beneficial both for you and for your family? To engage participants, we've also reached out to established and trusted community-based partners to help us bridge that connection and that contact with those that are most impacted and those who can benefit the most from this work. So together we will determine the best strategies to inform e-mobility solutions for this audience. Now, at times we've gotten hesitancy or pushback from partners for investing time and resources to do this critical piece of work. So doing these community-based assessments where you're listening and leaning into communities' needs and strength. So our response at EV Hybrid Noire always is that your project or your pilot is going to be so much more effective and robust if you're listening and leaning into community and really incorporating the feedback as much as possible. Now, community engagement, if that is absent from your process, you might end up with a project that does not deliver the intended results, and it could be a waste of resources as well as time.
Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, I really like the concrete, specific strategies you recommend for community engagement. In work, I have seen constant, what mode of transportation are you taking? How are you getting around? And you absolutely have to go deeper than that because we're more complicated. Our movement is more complicated than just what mode we take. Now, drilling down into a specific municipality, Marcel, this question is for you. Los Angeles has applied for and won a lot of competitive grant opportunities in the past couple of years. In what ways have these grants worked well, and what are some downfalls?
Thanks, Issa. So I think there's a big universe of funding in Los Angeles and in the state of California that we're really fortunate from. I think it'd be remiss to not first acknowledge that there was a lot of groundwork that's been done for decades to make that possible. When we're looking at cap and trade dollars, specifically creating funding opportunities for disadvantaged communities, when we're looking at the recent Measure R and Measure M half-cent sales tax that go to fund mass transit and then also provide local return opportunities for infrastructure improvement. Those things make us competitive when we go after bigger pots of money at the federal level, right? And because we are taking care of what we know are like the main transportation infrastructure projects, it allows us to acknowledge and to spend time doing work on all of the in-between work, right? Like, and understand and acknowledge that mass transit is a key part of the solution, but it's not the solution for everybody, right? If you're a mother, if you're a student, if you're an older adult, you're going to have other mobility needs that you're going to need to do. And we're also very fortunate in Los Angeles. We have a rich ecosystem of community-based organizations, nonprofit, that are not just in the transportation space, but are also in the public health space, also in the racial justice space, in the education space, early education. All those things matter. And so I think what's made us successful is in part putting together coalitions that not only have the boots on the ground, but then also the departments, the city, the engineers, the planners, bringing the technical piece to the table. But I think also just political support and leadership, right? I think that, when you look at the previous mayor really starting on the half-cent sales tax, this mayor continuing that along. I'm not sure if folks caught the State of the City last week, but Mayor Garcetti announced that he is going to be working with the board to provide free transit for students this summer, and shooting at, for 2022, providing, and again, it's not free transit, fairless transit for low income, right? So the work that we've done is building off of those types of efforts to see what do you need, right? And as much as we're looking at kind of future of technology, transportation technology, electric vehicles, micromobility, the reality check when we talk to stakeholders, they're like, that's cool, but my street needs to be paved, right? Or I need a sidewalk. And so I think those are the elements that really having those conversations, and it's not that we're not doing that work. I think sometimes we're just not representing collectively the work that we're doing together. And so I think what's making us successful is really starting to kind of connect the dots so that we're not just doing one specific project, but like multi-benefit projects that look at not just solving mobility, sustainability issues, but also providing workforce opportunities. As Dr. Francis said, really recognizing local community knowledge. And in this instance, figuring out ways to compensate folks, to provide them the tools of training, but then also acknowledge that, okay, the meeting's in the evening, we gotta have childcare, right? We gotta have food there, right? And so those things sometimes aren't easily factored into a funding opportunity, right? They're, oh, we'll pay for the train, but we can't pay for the Subway sandwiches, right? And so those are the types of things that you just kind of like the little things. But I think that those are the collective things that have allowed us to find some success. But I think there are still a lot of challenges because when you start working on the new stuff, you need staff, right? And hiring folks, training folks with new skills, those are all things that need to be done, right? Like you can't tell an engineer, hey, I need you to go out there and lead this racial equity training for us, right? So it's doing all of that work internally first, and maybe not first, but at the same time that you're doing that work in the community, and then finding those other partnerships, right? Like how do you work with the foundation world? How do you work with other cities and municipalities, et cetera? But I think it's a huge opportunity. Really, really enthusiastic about the language that's coming out of the White House and Secretary of Transportation. I think we got to keep it on there. There's a lot of opportunities. There's going to be a lot of money in the way that there was a lot of money out of the American Recovery Act, the ARA. So I think it's really important that we make sure that funding is really creating those multi-benefit projects so that it's not just, it's also increasing broadband access and looking at the digital divide, making sure that the unbanked isn't being left behind as well. So it's an exciting time. It's a lot of work, and I think there's a lot of opportunities, to get it right.
Thanks, Marcel. I really love the idea of doing the capacity building, bringing in new team members, new staff, while also engaging with community, and ideally being able to actually bring community into positions as well. And I just wanted to ask a quick clarifying question. Could you just maybe quickly explain the difference between the fareless and free transit?
I think it's an acknowledgement that it's not going to be free, right? Someone has to pay for it, right? And so does that funding, right? And those are the complicated questions, and I think something that Beth was referring to, right? Like it's easy to cut a ribbon on something, but how do you sustain it, right? I don't know if folks saw, but I think this past week in Mexico City, a train collapsed, and that was because the lack of attention of maintenance, post an earthquake, right? And so there are other sad examples of that happening across this country as well. We're not immune to it, and so I think you got to think holistically, about what does it mean, and what are the financing mechanisms to do that. And so fareless means that there's no fare charged to the user, but there's still a price to be paid, and so that's why it's not free.
Thank you for providing that distinction. So now we're going to shift into a few questions that we'd like to hear multiple perspectives on. So if two of you want to chime in, or all three, that'd be great. Let's start with Shelley on this one. What is needed to replicate or scale community-driven equity pilots and programs compared to more of the traditional ones?
That's a great question. So my thoughts is that one of the things that is needed to replicate or scale community-driven equity pilots and programs is really widespread awareness from diverse and trusted sources. So e-mobility and multimodal mobility can be seen as out of reach to many communities, especially when one does not have access to, reliable infrastructure or the finances. So, one of the things that's really interesting is frequently I get asked questions about electric vehicles, of course, and, are the prices coming down? Are they really affordable to non-affluent communities? And so my answer is always a resounding yes. But that's not often the narrative that is lifted up. It's not often the narrative that multimodal mobility options are lifted up or that rural communities are included in this conversation. And so I think it's really important that our organization, EV Hybrid Noire, really believes in exposing community partners and our markets, target partners that we're working with about the variety of equitable multimodal e-mobility solutions that are available. We do this by offering opportunities to not just listen to a EV 101 session or engage that way, but we also provide experiences to touch, feel, and really see and experience those vehicles and the technology. So these types of events, along with who the messenger is, messenger really matters, particularly when you're talking about communities that have not often been engaged in this conversation, or that just don't even see people that look like themselves utilizing this type of technology. So it's really important that these types of events and experiences are offered. Now, that's easier said than done in many communities, and particularly when you're talking about minority populations or frontline communities, and due to historic and systemic experiences and inequities are deliberately or unintentionally left out of the conversation. So to really elevate and scale community-driven programs, those at the top, so those leaders, the politicians, the utilities, OEMs, they also need to carve out a path that makes it an easier process for different communities to be welcome and to engage in those communities. So whether it's in a town hall or just in the decision-making process for what programs and multimodal options are offered in communities, when this happens, it's a win-win opportunity. And also when you allocate resources, making sure that those resources are intentional and engagement can be scaled. And one of the things that we've really been leaning into is like the public policy advocacy piece. So we've been doing work, we informed the EVs for Underserved Communities Act that was put forth by Yvette Clarke and Senator Cortez Masto. And that really focuses on building out infrastructure, education, and outreach. And we've also worked with Representative Bobby Rush on his no exhaust bill. So we're really just trying to make sure that the ecosystem is equitable and accessible to all. And we're not just talking about one narrowly defined e-mobility option.
Yeah, I love the comprehensive ecosystem way of thinking about that. That's amazing. Maybe we can go to Beth to see if you have a thought on this.
Sure. I think this when it comes to building projects that or pilots, some of the same challenges for traditional ones and community-driven equity pilots are the same, frankly. You want to make sure that you have a funding source that can support your work. You want to make sure that the programs allow the flexibility for you to try things out. A lot of programs at the state and federal level, especially in transportation, are not really conducive to pilots. They're really meant for the construction of permanent things. And so recognizing that, we'll point out that it's really the biggest cities that will most be able to take advantage of it, and even they will struggle from time to time. We want piloting to be available to communities of all sizes and resources and skills. And so the other thing is sharing information about what other communities have tried, something like what you're trying and what they've learned. Too often we learn about best practices, but we don't learn about where a community stumbled. That's actually more valuable in a lot of cases, is understanding what didn't work so that you don't repeat it, you know what to avoid. And then just some good guidance on how to tackle these sorts of issues, and working with people like Dr. Francis to understand what sort of things you need to consider as you walk into a discussion with that community, and really thinking about tailoring your pilot. Even with pilots, sometimes we get a success and it works and we think we can just then cut and paste it in different places, and that's just not really going to work. The whole point of piloting and trying new things and is recognizing that it should fit the context, it should fit the community, it should address the needs locally.
Yeah, I'm hearing from both Dr. Francis and Beth like a real need to be able to work with those key legislators, decision makers to almost help set the ecosystem, set the foundation to enable more community-informed mobility pilots, as well as working with the communities themselves to tailor the pilots towards their needs. Curious to hear from you, Marcel, and your work with LADOT, like kind of the same question, want to hear your perspective, but also maybe if you could somewhat kind of speak to that challenge of making sure that the path is laid with legislators so that we can actually start to create these kind of innovative and equity-driven pilots.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that Beth said that just really resonates is knowledge sharing, right? I think that we would not, particularly the need to knowledge share. It's something that I always try to mention is that for cities and for just collectively to knowledge share right now is so important because of it. I think the emergence of transportation technology companies, right? Who really kind of want to come in and I think private sector dollars really have an approach to scaling that isn't necessarily has time to do community engagement and outreach, right? In that real way. And so I think that could be a scary thing for cities, right? Like, you have someone who's the bike planner in your city, going up against private sector dockless mobility companies, who have attorneys and planners and engineers and data people and advertising and lobbyists. So like those types of things, and I say that as an example, I think, because it was a real big learning moment for us as a city. We couldn't have gotten through all of that work without other cities, right? And without working with other cities and sharing kind of our experiences. Now, I don't say that, and I hope no one takes that as like an us versus them, perspective, because what private investment in mobility has been able to do is scale outcomes as well. And so I think it's our job as cities to almost kind of be the parents in the room, because all of the companies are the children kind of fighting against each other for market share. And so I think that we'd be remiss to think about this, not looking at private sector who want to operate and provide mobility options in our cities as a key partner to delivering the outcomes, but specifically the equity outcomes that we want. And so that's an element, that I think I wanted to just bring into the fold, because it is that continues to be the way people move in our cities, right? We in LA, we took kind of like a hiatus from going to your traditional planning conferences, and we started going to the conferences where the companies were, right? Where the new technology is being built and developed, so that we can partner with them and we can tell them, okay, that's cool, but have you thought about this, right? And so, we want to be partners with them, but we have a responsibility to the folks who live in our cities, right? That work and visit. And so I think that's a key piece that tends to get lost. And that's not the stuff that I think they teach you in school, right? That's just like depending on the school you go to, right? And like, if you're getting an MBA, that's probably what, it's there for you, but it's really trying to get these other perspectives. And, the other thing too is just also find partnerships with academia as well. And like do what you're good at, right? If we're good at planning the route, let's plan the route. But like, let's bring our researching community into the fold early on, so that they can help work with you and the community to kind of understand what are the outcomes and how we're going to try to measure this stuff longitudinally, so that we can make the case, hey, we want more money because look at the outcomes.
I just want to jump on something Marcel said, which is everyone has a job, everyone has a role, and they need to do what they're good at. The companies that cities need to partner with to provide good service are there to provide a service. It is not their job to set public policy. And there are too many localities that are outsourcing the setting of public policy to private companies. That's not fair to them, and it's not fair to your constituents. They are providing a tool, they are providing a service. That service, when plugged into a bad public policy regime, will provide bad results. That tool or service, when plugged into a good public policy regime, will produce a good result. That is the elected representatives and the career staff of agencies' job to produce, not any tool provider or company providing a service.
Thanks for chiming in on that, Beth. And I think, kind of want to transition this conversation a little bit. Hearing that, right, it's these TNCs and private companies that often have the money, they have the budgets and resources, teams to be able to affect policy in their favor, often at the, sometimes at the detriment of communities. And I'm wondering, with the new, federal funding that's coming in, how can that funding best be used to empower, underserved communities so that we can actually build their ability to affect policy and create change that is more of a balance and more of a partnership, kind of as Marcel was explaining. And I can start with Dr. Francis on this one.
I think you're always starting with me. No, seriously, that's a really profound and great question. So I'll start off first. Because of who I am and my background and what I do, I got to talk about the public health implications of what we're doing. So this is like, we're having this real conversation, but at the end of the day, the policies, the programs, the pilots are really a life and death matter for many of these communities. It's a public health crisis that not enough people are talking about. So one of the things that the administration can do is really lean into providing additional resources for us to be able to better evaluate the public health impacts and implications of transportation emissions. We need to make sure that community partners have enough resources and technical capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by these things shortly. Also, we need to make sure that we are really supporting different mobility options based on what community needs and gaps are around e-mobility. So we shouldn't be prioritizing one like heavy duty freight or transportation, first and last miles over another. We have data now based on a recent study that just came out recently that really looks at how the different racial and ethnic groups and communities are impacted by different aspects of air pollution. So some communities for African American, it's primarily light vehicle and heavy duty. Other communities, it's more industrial and light duty. So we need to lean into research and provide funding so that we can support more research that gets to those issues. But in addition to that, it's really important to provide funding opportunities that provide resources for formative research. So it's really imperative that people, as they're applying for these different funding opportunities to better understand the e-mobility or e-mobility ecosystem, that they have to engage with their target audience, their key stakeholders, to determine what these audiences need and identify how they are aligned or are not aligned with funding priorities. So these projects, basically what I'm saying is they need to factor in community needs, not just the needs of the prime organization that's applying for it. And to really ensure that you get the outcomes right, it's really important that you assess, you plan, implement, and then evaluate. Also, I would suggest, please simplify the application process. I don't know how many of you have applied for federal funding, but it's not the easiest thing to do. From the RFP language all the way over to applying for and managing the grant, it can be a challenge for many community organizations or partners who have not done this type of work before. And I've seen this issue addressed in other fields, so I know it's possible for us to make this process more streamlined. So organizations may need capacity building experience and support to be able to apply for this type of extramural funding. And then I would also say, from an equity perspective, thinking about funds need to be focused on lower income, underrepresented frontline communities that are impacted first and worst by air pollution. I'm really pleased and excited to see that the Biden administration is prioritizing these communities so that they are allocated a certain percentage of funding for these different awards. So again, I think I got to hone in on the fact that making sure that these programs and pilots that we put forth are really culturally appropriate, that the right messengers, the right technical experts are part of the process, because what we don't want to do is further exacerbate racial disparities through funding opportunities that are not really engaging the populations that need the most support and that really can benefit the most from these types of programs.
So I will say that we should not assume that funding is coming. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get any package passed. So it's good to think about what you'll do, but first there's a lot of work to do to make sure Congress actually adopts some of the proposals and is able to pass legislation providing funding. Also, we have to make sure that the funding they provide is useful in any of the respects we're discussing here today. The way transportation funds in particular tend to work is members of Congress say loudly their intent on how they want the funding to be used, but they don't put it in the law. And it apparently their goal is if they just do this hard enough, that's how the money will be spent. But the program sends the money to provide the same thing we've always gotten. And when you hear talk about, broadly supported bipartisan legislation in transportation, it's usually status quo. So we'll send out the money to do the same thing that it has done for the last 70 years. And no matter how hard they do this, they'll get the same results. So if we want it to look different, there's a fight ahead to make sure the funding goes out in a different way. A lot of times what happens in transportation is someone says, our roadway system is incredibly unsafe to people outside of a car. Our own Dangerous by Design report that we released earlier this year shows that the impact of that danger falls very heavily on Black and Native American communities, much more so than any other groups. And we need to do something about this. So we're going to go create a program to affect it. And we're going to provide this much money to fix 70 years of mistakes. And we're going to keep spending this much money to create new mistakes while we do this. That's how the deal is always struck. This gives us a win, but the system continues untouched. We can't allow that. No new programs. If there's a problem with the program needs to change. That's going to upset people to hear, but that's how we get real good results that can come down to the local level and really impact things. And I'll just finish by saying that the system we have, the priority of moving vehicles quickly over quality of life, equitable access to opportunity, safety, all of these other things wasn't invented separately by 50 state departments of transportation and 84,000 local jurisdictions. It was created at a very centralized location. And when the Fed started to loosen up the rules to allow for more flexibility, they didn't provide guidance or help in how to do things differently. So that flexibility just really means it's easier to keep doing things the way we've always done things. And most communities and most states do. So we really need the Federal Highway Administration in particular, but DOT in general, to step up and provide better guidance, better tools, better rules associated with how federal dollars are spent, which is something that they don't have to wait for Congress to do. Dr. Francis just mentioned applying for federal funding easier. Well, the competitive grants at USDOT are a prime example of something that needs to be made much easier to apply for. And they could set up a system that is automatic, online, an online application that you don't need to spend tens of thousands of dollars to work on, an online benefit cost analysis so that you don't have to hire someone to do that. They just have to make the decision to do it.
Marcel, you want to take a shot on this one too?
Yeah, I mean, like I think Beth said before, right? Like there's some good language coming out of there, just to go hyper specific, and as a testament to how challenging it is, to put together these applications. City of LA just previously submitted a response to the US DOT infra grant. And that's something that is, and I looked at it naively through like an equity, new mobility lens. And when I started getting into the guts of that grant, it, you know, soonly realized that it is a project, a funding source that has traditionally been for, you know, freight movement, economic development, national significance work. But I wasn't satisfied with that. I started kept on piecing through the solicitation, and there was language for the first time that talked about racial equity, climate justice. And so I really kind of just hung on to that. And we ended up submitting a really robust project that was about improving infrastructure, road infrastructure on the national highway system in South Los Angeles, along a project area where we lose 20 lives a year. And you know, we had to calculate that into a cost benefit analysis, right? And we had, and I think that's, you shouldn't need someone with 13 years experience who's worked in political offices, who's at the executive level, who has deep relationships in the 5 departments that we organized with, and that is able to pull a grant application together in a month. It shouldn't require that. We did it, and we asked for $46 million to do that, and we layered on broadband, electrification, EV car sharing. We got 43 letters of support. We're talking about workforce development. It's all this stuff. And even when we were talking regionally with other partners, people were raising their eyebrows and they're like, oh, that's a cute project, right? And, you know, not thinking that an LADOT, because we don't traditionally go after those projects, right? But I think it's going to take that type of creativity, doggedness, to keep on doing it until it makes it easier. And that just becomes the status quo of the types of projects that people are going for. We'll see what happens. But I think it really, I think, showed our partner departments and our community organizations that we partnered with about what's possible when you think about a broader swath, right? And you don't just think about the one project.
We're coming up on the last 8 or so minutes of the panel, and I mean, I think that you all three really, you know, touched on the importance of making this process, applying for grants, applying for funding, much more simple and accessible. And you know, I'd love to hear some thoughts, you know, from all three of you, any of you, about how we can, as organizations, CBOs, individuals, you know, underrepresented communities, actually make that happen and start to work with legislators at the local, you know, state or federal level to simplify these applications for all of the different, you know, kinds of incentive programs, mobility pilot programs. How can we really hold the administrators of these funding opportunities, of these mobility pilot programs, you know, accountable to making sure that they are working for us, but that they're also accessible from an application perspective?
Well, I'll jump in. I definitely think elevating it, remind your legislators, your congressional delegation that these are expensive. It's expensive to apply, which means a lot of times we just won't bother, because especially for high demand programs like what was known as the Tiger program when I was at USDOT, and has changed names multiple times now. It can be prohibitively expensive to engage, especially if your chance of getting funded is low. So just reminding them, because they can give the agencies a big push, repeating it to the agencies and reminding them it's within their ability to improve that. And then remembering that competitive grants are actually a very small part of funding in transportation in particular, from the state or the federal level. And there's a lot of funding that is distributed at the discretion of the state in particular, In California, at the Metropolitan Planning Organization, a little bit more. In other places, it can be theoretically at that level, at the regional level, but it's really controlled by the state DOT. And recognizing the power you have to see that that money is distributed to your priorities through their process. And again, there's a lot of power in pushing your governor and pushing your state legislators to make sure that that department pays attention to what you're trying to do.
Just a small note, building off of that, is also push your cities, right? Like, you know, because especially now, right? Like, people are tired. People are, you know, we just got through COVID, right? Like, the folks are going to start hiring again. I know here in the city of LA, we lost a lot of people to retirement, and there was a hiring freeze. But that shouldn't be communities' problems, right? They should push on their local electeds to make sure that they're prioritizing that type of work, right? That is representative of them. And you know, no, I think we still need to be doing some of the technical work, right? And we shouldn't be putting that technical work on communities. But communities should say, hey, that technical work needs to be informed by my reality, right? And so pushing on cities and regions to help fund that work, I think is a and, right? It's like what Beth said, and do this as well. Everyone's got a role.
And I guess what I would add to that conversation is looking at this from a 30,000-foot view. What we're talking about is really a triple bottom line where there's opportunities for all communities. So you're talking about you're improving transportation and mobility options. You are addressing public health issues and mitigating the impact of greenhouse gases. And then you're also, which we often don't talk about enough, I think, is providing workforce development opportunities to frontline community members, as well as other communities, rural communities. So, you know, in terms of thinking about how to make this process easier, just like we think about, you know, applying for a credit card or whatever it is, those processes are so much easier than what we're talking about now. So we're very intelligent people. And there's folks who are vested in this conversation in terms of making this a much easier and just accessible process. And I think the good thing is that we're at a point in time right now where the current administration is really leaning into hearing, like, where are the roadblocks, where are the barriers, what are the challenges, and they're willing to work with us, those of us on the panel, those of us who are working in the space, to really address this and really dismantle some of the barriers and the institutional challenges that Beth mentioned earlier, really trying to do our work from a different lens and a different way. So we know that if something is broken, we should try a different approach. We know that the system is broken in many places, and we need to really make sure that we lean into different strategies while engaging those who haven't often been part of the process in the conversation. Because what we say is that a lot of times the solutions to community problems or public health issues or social issues lay really with the audience or the market segment that is experiencing those issues.
Well, we're at time, but I really want to thank each of our panelists today for sharing your insight. You all brought such great ideas and energy, and I think you all really spoke to each other's different geographies and sectors really well. So really appreciate the attention to that. And like you all said, it's an ecosystem that we need. We need to work together in partnership. We need to understand that this is a yes and environment that we need to be moving into. And I want to thank the audience for attending. And at this point.